Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Percival Everett's new novel, The Trees, published by Graywolf Press. This book came out just a couple weeks ago, and I'll just say up front, this book is incredible. I think it's, so far, my top new release of the year. It reads like a pulp detective novel, but the ideas that it explores are so vast and so complicated, but somehow he's able to explore all of these ideas in such a readable and fun way. This book is also just hilarious. I usually don't laugh out loud while reading books that often, but this book really got to me a few times, which is very surprising considering the subject matter. But Percival Everett moves back and forth between just hilarious dialogue and describing some of the most heinous actions committed in the United States in the past century or so in such a fluid way, and is really the juxtaposition between this tragedy and comedy that, like so many great authors before him, that make Percival Everett such a great writer, and this book just so good. So what is this book about? As I noted earlier, it's a kind of a detective novel. This book opens in the town of Money, Mississippi, and I'll just read the opening quick paragraph because I really like it. Money, Mississippi looks exactly like it sounds, named in that persistent Southern tradition of irony and with the attendant tradition of nations. The name becomes slightly sad, a marker of self-conscious ignorance that might as well be embraced because, let's face it, it isn't going away. And in this town, there is a string of murders occurring. And there's something really odd that's going on with these murders. At each crime scene, there are two bodies. One is a white man who looks like he was just strangled to death with barbed wire. And then the other body is the body of a black man who looks very badly beaten and his body is very, very cold. Everyone notes that he looks more dead than the white man. And the black body, the black man, is holding the castrated testicles of the white man in his hand. I'll come back to that detail in just a minute. But these murder scenes are gruesome. But what's particularly disturbing is that they call the coroner and they bring the bodies back to the lab, but then the black body disappears. And in fact, just a few days later, they get a call to another crime scene, and the same black body is there. And the scene looks the exact same. A white man was strangled with barbed wire, and the black body is there holding the castrated testicles of the white man. And then the black body disappears once again. And this sets off sort of mass hysteria in the town because the police don't really know what's happening. Why are these white men being murdered? And who is this black man, this corpse of a black man that's also at all of these crime scenes? And where does the body keep going? And so this is all going on, and the local police sheriff really can't figure out what's happening. So the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation sends two men to help with the investigation. These two men are Ed and Jim, and they're both black men. And so while this white sheriff and all of his white officers, who are all incredibly racist, by the way, while they're investigating these crime scenes that seem to have a racial element, though they're not entirely sure what it is, these two black men from the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation come in, who are higher up in the legal hierarchy, and they kind of take over. And I note this detail because there's this level of fear that's kind of played for laughs in these interactions between Ed and Jim and the Sheriff Red Jetty. Because not only are white men in this town kind of systematically being murdered in a very similar way that it looks like there's a serial killer or something like that, but the sheriff in the town is now kind of having his job taken out from underneath him by these two black men. The white sheriff is kind of becoming subservient to these two investigators. But back to the disappearing corpse though. This corpse, as I noted, is really badly beaten, almost beyond recognition, and they can't really identify who it is. They'll get it to forensics to run DNA tests and stuff like that, but then the body will disappear, or they won't be able to run the DNA tests. One character, Ed Jethro, who is kind of an idiot, has his theory about where this body keeps going. He says, "I think we're all suffering from mass hysteria around here. You see, there weren't no black men at either crime scene. We're just so afraid of black people in this country that we see them everywhere. I mean, there's black men all around, but not dead ones. Not like this dead one." "How do you explain the pictures?" Ed asked. "I ain't ironed that out." "Good theory though," Jim says. "You keep working on it." So Ed Jethro is clearly wrong, right? the body is real. They're not just imagining it. But this idea of the fear of black bodies and the fear of revenge, especially from black men, is built into this white supremacist town and, well, the entire country. It's embedded into the history of the United States in a way. And in fact, this body in the first couple of chapters is mistakenly identified as the body of Emmett Till, who in the 1950s was murdered in Money, Mississippi. And there's even a white character who in the first chapter admits that she was complicit in the murder of Emmett Till. And I don't really want to go into a ton of detail here because this is a detective novel in a lot of ways, so you can spoil it. But I hope, as you can see, that there is this cultural haunting taking place in this book. All of these white characters are haunted by kind of their present racism, but also their past racist actions. The white men who are being killed all have familial ties to a series of murders of black men. But the entire town of Money, Mississippi, and eventually the entire United States, it expands outward very quickly, they're all being haunted because of their complicity in these racist acts. A lot of the white characters in this book are actually in the Ku Klux Klan, and so this cultural legacy of lynchings and beatings of black bodies is haunting them, both ideologically, but now physically. And a lot of these ideas are actually shared with one of my favorite books of all time, a book I just got finished teaching last week. I love this book, Jesmyn Ward's 2017 National Book Award winner, Sing Unburied Sing, which also deals with these ideas of personal trauma, but the more broad idea of cultural trauma kind of haunting these characters. And there's actually a lot of interesting connection between these two books. The importance of trees in both novels is completely, or is really apparent. I mean, if you've read Sing Unburied Sing, if you read to the end of Sing Unburied Sing, you probably know what I mean. But like Jesmyn Ward and like Toni Morrison before her, Percival Everett is using this cultural haunting to explore not only the cultural history of race and racism in the United States, but the modern effects and the modern ramifications of this history, how it affects people of color today, how the past is in the past, but it isn't really past. There's a great book on this idea of cultural haunting, especially in African-American literature, by Kathleen Brogan, called Cultural Hauntings, Ghosts and Ethnicity in Recent American Fiction, or Recent American Literature, which explores this idea a lot, in which my understanding of these three authors is really coming from. I use that book when I teach Jesmyn Ward Sing Unburied Sing. It's very, very pertinent. So this cultural legacy of murdering black men specifically haunts this town of Money, Mississippi. And I do want to focus a little bit on the history of lynching for just a second, because Everett is clearly playing with the specifics of this history. When we're talking about lynching in the United States, we're talking about race, obviously, but we're also talking about gender and sexuality. And I think that sometimes gets overlooked when we talk about lynching. Emmett Till was beaten to death by a group of white men because he was accused by a white woman of whistling at her. That is, he was killed because white men perceived him as a sexual threat and wanted to protect the purity of the white woman. And this is a pretty common idea even today, whether it's fully conscious or not. I mean, white supremacists have, the 14 words and the Great Replacement theory and all this other bullshit. And it's all stemming from this same perceived issue and the same perceived connection between race and sexuality. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is because this notion reminded me a lot of this amazing memoir, an amazing cultural studies book called Hung, a meditation on the measure of black men in America by Scott Poulson-Bryant, who was actually one of my former professors. But what Scott explores in this book so wonderfully is this connection between society's obsession with black male sexuality and, well, understandings of race and racism. I mean, look at the discourse around Lil Nas X recently. But Scott's book goes into further detail into modern gender and sexuality studies, looking particularly at popular culture, which is all just, again, fantastic scholarship, and it's a beautiful personal memoir. But the thesis of Hung is rooted in the Emmett Till case. In fact, the first chapter of Hung is a letter that Scott Poulson-Bryant pens to Emmett Till. And of course, Scott is playing with the language of this connection between hung and hanged, linking the perception and obsession with black male genitalia with the historic act of lynching. And this connection is really evident in the trees, right? There's a reason why the dead male body at all of these crime scenes is holding the white male victim's testicles in his hands. This is just the deepest fears and the deepest cultural anxieties of these white men come to fruition. Here, these racist white men don't fear that black men will symbolically castrate them by marrying white women, but that they will physically castrate them. It's a sort of Tarantino-esque violent revenge for the effects of this racist anxiety. The Trees is also very interested in the idea of an archive, as so many of these lynchings throughout history create, well, statistics rather than individual deaths. This is something that groups like BLM has come to advocate for a lot, right? The hashtag say her name campaign is a really important one. But in this book, there is this wonderful character named Mama Z, who is 105 years old. She's hilarious and really, really interesting. And again, I don't want to spoil too much here, but she's working on this archive of every single lynching throughout the 20th century. And she has a personal reason to do this. Her father was lynched, and so he is the first name in this archive. But her house is filled with just boxes and boxes of files, just full of different names. And of course, the cover of this book, which is a great cover, is also just filled with this list of names. These are the names that Mama Z is documenting and protecting. And this is just horrific. Read through these names. I spent a couple hours just Googling random names on this list because they're all historically real people, real victims of lynching. And I should note that they aren't all black. There is this intersectionality going on here. A lot of the names here are Chinese or Vietnamese. White supremacy doesn't only hurt black people. And of course, there are absences of names recorded here. There are names that are just, say, unnamed male or children. But the recording of an absence is still very important. And this archival work is very similar, I think, to a lot of Holocaust literature, which I realize is a terrible name, but I don't really know what else to call it, in that so-called Holocaust literature also tries to regather the individual names of the victims and preserve them for the future, to retain the individual in the face of them just becoming an incomprehensible statistic. Daša Drndić does this a lot, and her books are filled with just lists of names. Tadeusz Borowski, his books are similar in a way, and then of course Primo Levi also sort of does this in that they all try to regather these individual stories, but most importantly, these individual names. They try to regather the individual. So this book is heavy, but it's also just so damn funny. And again, I really did not expect a book that's about the cultural legacy of lynching in the United States to be funny. But like I said at the beginning, Everett has such an ability to move between just tragedy and dialogue that is really funny. Right? Most of the humor in this comes in the form of dialogue. And he has the ability to move back and forth between these that is really just so compelling and is so jarring. But by doing that, it actually makes both of the tragedy and the comedy much more powerful. Here's just one quick snippet from pretty early on that I just found to be so funny. This is the police just got a call about the first murder, and the chapter just opens. "God damn it, I hate murder more than just about anything," said Sheriff Red Jetty. "It can just ruin a day." "Because it's such a waste of life?" the coroner, Reverend Cad Fondle, asked. He had just pronounced Junior and the unidentified black man dead without so much as touching them. "No, it's because it's a mess. It is a lot of blood," Fondle said. "I don't give a shit about the blood, it's the goddamn paperwork." So good. If you're interested in reading this book, I strongly encourage you and recommend that you go check out the interview done with Percival Everett on the Between the Covers podcast. It's an incredible interview, and Everett really talks a lot about and critiques modern discussions of race, white supremacy, the South, etc. It's a really great conversation that moves way beyond what I was able to focus on here. But for now, let me know if you read The Trees or any of Percival Everett's other novels. Again, this is one of the best books I've read this year, and so far it's probably in my top 2 favorite new releases this year. I really can't recommend it enough. But for now, thanks for watching.